The morning sun cast long shadows across the entrance of Fort Bradley military base as Margaret Chen adjusted the worn leather strap of her messenger bag. At 52, she carried herself with quiet dignity despite the whispers that followed her wherever she went. Her simple black dress and comfortable walking shoes marked her as a civilian among the crisp uniforms and polished boots that dominated the military installation. Margaret had been coming to this base every Tuesday for the past 3 months, always carrying the same weathered manila envelope and always requesting to speak with someone in command. The security guards at the main gate had grown accustomed to her routine visits, though their reactions ranged from polite dismissal to barely concealed irritation. "Ma'am, as I've explained before, you need an appointment to meet with any commanding officers," Sergeant Mills said for what felt like the 100th time. His voice carried the practiced patience of someone who dealt with civilian complaints regularly. "You can't just walk onto a military base and expect to see generals." Margaret's eyes, a deep brown that seemed to hold decades of stories, remained steady. "I understand your protocol, Sergeant, but what I have here concerns national security. I've tried going through proper channels, but no one will listen." Behind Mills, Corporal Jackson rolled his eyes dramatically. "Lady, every conspiracy theorist and disgruntled citizen thinks they have information about national security. You need to file your concerns through civilian channels, not bother military personnel." The small crowd of off-duty soldiers waiting to enter the base began to take notice of the exchange. Some pulled out their phones, anticipating another episode of what they'd started calling the Tuesday Show. Margaret had become something of a fixture, a source of mild entertainment for those who had heard about her weekly attempts to gain access. "Look at her," whispered Private Rodriguez to his companion. "Same dress, same bag, same crazy story probably. Why doesn't she just give up?" His friend, Private Chen, shook his head with amusement. "My mom says there's always one in every town. Thinks they've uncovered some big secret that the military is hiding. Next thing you know, she'll be talking about aliens or something." Margaret could hear the murmurs and see the pointing, but she had developed a thick skin over the past few months. She had faced worse than mockery in her life. Growing up as the daughter of Chinese immigrants in a small Texas town had taught her to endure sideways glances and dismissive comments. Her father had always told her that dignity came not from how others treated you, but from how you carried yourself despite their treatment. "Sergeant Mills," Margaret continued, her voice remaining calm and measured, "I'm not asking for much. Just 10 minutes with someone who has the authority to review what I've brought. I promise you, if you knew what was in this envelope, you wouldn't be so quick to dismiss me." Mills glanced at his watch, clearly wanting to end the conversation. The morning shift change was approaching, and he had paperwork to complete. "Ma'am, I've been patient with you for months now. But regulations are regulations. If you don't have proper authorization, I cannot allow you past this checkpoint." The growing crowd of onlookers began to voice their own opinions. A group of young recruits, fresh out of basic training, found the situation particularly amusing. "Hey, lady, maybe try the circus instead," called out one recruit, causing a ripple of laughter among his peers. "I heard they're looking for people with wild stories." Another added, "Yeah, or maybe write a book." Fiction section, of course. Margaret turned slightly to acknowledge the comments, her expression remaining composed. "I understand why you might think this is amusing," she said, her voice carrying across the small gathering. "But sometimes the most important truths come from the most unexpected sources." Corporal Jackson stepped forward, his patience clearly wearing thin. "Ma'am, you're causing a disruption. I'm going to have to ask you to leave the premises. You can return next week if you want to waste your time again, but right now you're interfering with base operations." "What exactly is she interfering with?" came a new voice from behind the crowd. The soldiers parted to reveal Master Sergeant Williams, a 20-year veteran whose stern expression immediately commanded respect. Unlike the younger soldiers, Williams didn't seem amused by the situation. His weathered face bore the lines of someone who had seen real conflict, and his eyes held a sharpness that came from years of evaluating threats and assessing situations. "Sergeant Williams," Mills straightened immediately. "This civilian has been trying to gain unauthorized access to speak with command staff. She claims to have information about national security, but she refuses to go through proper channels." Williams studied Margaret for a long moment, taking in her composed demeanor and the way she held herself despite the obvious mockery from the crowd. Something in her bearing reminded him of his own mother, who had faced similar dismissals when she tried to report safety violations at the factory where she worked. "And what exactly have you told her about these proper channels?" Williams asked. Mills shifted uncomfortably. "Well, sir, I've explained that she needs to contact the appropriate civilian authorities, file reports through the proper agencies, that sort of thing. Have you asked her what specific information she has?" "Sir, we can't just listen to every civilian who claims to have important information. Half of them are conspiracy theorists, and the other half are just looking for attention." Williams turned his attention to Margaret, who had remained silent during the exchange between the two soldiers. "Ma'am, I'm Master Sergeant Williams. Could you tell me, in general terms, what kind of information you believe you have?" Margaret looked into Williams' eyes and saw something different from the dismissive glances she had encountered before. Here was someone who was actually listening, actually considering that she might have something legitimate to say. "Sergeant Williams, 3 months ago, my late husband's personal effects were returned to me by the Army. Among his belongings was a flash drive containing communication records and operational plans that I believe expose a serious security breach in military operations overseas. I've tried contacting various agencies, but no one will review the information because I'm just a widow with no official standing." The murmur from the crowd died down as Williams processed this information. Margaret continued, "My husband, Colonel David Chen, died in Afghanistan 6 months ago. The Army told me it was an ambush, an unfortunate accident of war, but the information on this drive suggests that someone with access to classified operational details may have leaked information that led to his death and the deaths of 12 other soldiers." Williams felt a chill run down his spine. Colonel David Chen's death had been significant news throughout the military community. Chen had been a respected intelligence officer whose loss was felt deeply throughout the ranks. If this woman was his widow, and if she truly had evidence of a security breach related to his death, then the situation was far more serious than a simple civilian complaint. "Ma'am," Williams said carefully, "do you have identification proving your relationship to Colonel Chen?" Margaret reached into her bag and withdrew a worn wallet, from which she produced a military ID card identifying her as Margaret Chen, spouse of Colonel David Chen. She also showed Williams a copy of the death certificate and the official letter from the Army notifying her of her husband's death in action. Williams examined the documents carefully, noting the official seals and signatures that would be difficult to fake. The crowd of soldiers had grown quiet, sensing that the mood had shifted from amusement to something more serious. "Mrs. Chen," Williams said, using her proper title for the first time, "I think we need to have someone review what you've brought. But I need you to understand that this will involve protocols that might take some time." "I understand, Sergeant Williams. I've been patient this long. I just want someone to take this seriously. 13 soldiers died, including my husband. If there's even a chance that their deaths could have been prevented, don't you think someone should look into it?" Williams nodded grimly. "Yes, ma'am, I do. Corporal Jackson, escort Mrs. Chen to the visitors' waiting area and provide her with appropriate refreshments. I need to make some phone calls." As Williams walked away to use his radio, the crowd of soldiers began to disperse, their earlier amusement replaced by a comfortable awareness that they might have been mocking a woman whose husband had died serving their country. The casual cruelty of their earlier comments now seemed petty and small. Private Rodriguez, who had been among the most vocal mockers, approached Margaret hesitantly. "Ma'am, I want to apologize for what I said earlier. I didn't know about your husband." Margaret looked at the young soldier, seeing in his face the same earnestness that her husband had often spoken about when describing the young men and women under his command. "There's no need to apologize, Private. You couldn't have known. But perhaps next time you'll remember that everyone has a story, and sometimes those stories are more complicated than they appear on the surface." As Margaret was escorted to the waiting area, word began to spread throughout the base about the widow of Colonel Chen and the potentially explosive information she carried. Phone calls were made, security clearances were verified, and slowly but surely the wheels of military bureaucracy began to turn. What none of them knew was that Margaret's visit on this particular Tuesday morning would set in motion a series of events that would reach the highest levels of military command, and ultimately expose one of the most damaging security breaches in recent military history. The woman they had laughed at was about to change everything. But first, she would have to navigate a system that was built to keep outsiders like her at arm's length. In her bag, the flash drive containing her husband's final communications waited patiently, holding secrets that would soon shake the very foundations of military operations overseas and bring justice for 13 soldiers who had died not in honest combat, but as victims of betrayal from within their own ranks. The Tuesday show was about to become something much more serious than anyone could have imagined. The visitors' waiting area at Fort Bradley was a sterile room painted in government-issue beige, furnished with uncomfortable metal chairs and outdated magazines. Margaret sat quietly, her hands folded over the manila envelope that had become her constant companion. Through the small window, she could see soldiers going about their daily routines, unaware that their world might be about to change dramatically. Master Sergeant Williams had been gone for over an hour, making what he described as necessary phone calls. During that time, Margaret had watched a steady stream of military personnel pass by the waiting room window, many stealing curious glances at the woman who had caused such a stir at the main gate. The door opened, and Williams returned accompanied by a tall, thin man in civilian clothes whose sharp eyes and confident bearing immediately marked him as someone accustomed to authority. Behind them walked Major Patricia Hendricks, whose crisp uniform and serious expression suggested she was someone who dealt with sensitive matters regularly. "Mrs. Chen," Williams began, "this is Agent Morrison from the Department of Defense Criminal Investigative Service and Major Hendricks from our base security office. They'd like to speak with you about the information you've brought." Agent Morrison stepped forward, extending his hand. "Mrs. Amsister Declode, Chen, I want to begin by expressing my condolences for your loss. Colonel Chen was a respected officer whose death was felt throughout the intelligence community. I understand you believe you have information related to his death?" Margaret shook Morrison's hand, noting the firm grip and direct gaze that suggested this was someone who took her seriously. "Yes, Agent Morrison. 3 days after David's personal effects were returned to me, I discovered a flash drive hidden in the lining of his shaving kit. It contained communications and documents that I believe show someone leaked operational information that led to the ambush that killed him and 12 other soldiers." Major Hendricks leaned forward slightly. "Mrs. Chen, I need to ask you some questions about your security clearance status. Have you ever been granted access to classified information?" "No, Major. David was always very careful about operational security. He never discussed his work at home beyond general terms, but when I saw what was on this drive, I knew it was important enough to risk whatever consequences might come from reviewing it." Morrison and Hendricks exchanged glances. The fact that Mrs. Chen had viewed potentially classified information without proper clearance created complications. But given the circumstances and the serious nature of her allegations, they had little choice but to proceed. "Mrs. Chen," Morrison continued, "before we can review any materials you've brought, I need to explain that you may be required to sign additional security agreements, and that what we discuss here today cannot be shared with anyone outside this room. Do you understand the gravity of that?" Margaret nodded solemnly. "Agent Morrison, my husband gave his life for this country. 12 other families lost their loved ones. If keeping quiet about what I know helps protect the people responsible for their deaths, then I'll have failed David and those other soldiers. I understand the seriousness of this situation." Major Hendricks pulled out a tablet and began typing. "Mrs. Chen, I'm going to need you to walk me through exactly how you discovered this information and what you've done with it since then. Start from the beginning." Margaret took a deep breath and began her story. She described receiving David's personal effects 6 months after his death, how the Army had delivered them in standard-issue cardboard boxes with official seals. She had put off going through his belongings for weeks, unable to face the emotional weight of handling his personal items. "When I finally worked up the courage to go through everything, I was looking for anything that might help me understand his final months," Margaret explained. "David had always been careful to remove any work-related items before coming home on leave, but I thought there might be letters or personal notes that would help me feel closer to him." She described finding the flash drive sewn into the lining of his shaving kit, clearly hidden there intentionally. David had always been meticulous about operational security, so the fact that he had hidden this information suggested he believed it was critically important. When I plugged the drive into my computer, I found dozens of communication files, operational reports, and what appeared to be intelligence briefings, Margaret continued. Most of it was beyond my understanding, but I could see dates, times, and locations. What caught my attention were communications dated just 3 days before David's death that contained detailed information about troop movements and planned operations. Morrison leaned forward intently. Mrs. Chen, did you recognize any names in these communications? Several, actually. I knew some of David's colleagues from social events and base functions over the years. But what disturbed me was seeing communications from someone I didn't recognize, someone with access to detailed operational plans who seemed to be sharing information with unauthorized recipients. Major Hendricks looked up from her tablet. What kind of unauthorized recipients? Margaret hesitated for a moment. Agent Morrison, I need to be honest with you. I'm not trained to analyze intelligence communications, but I spent 30 years as a high school mathematics teacher before David and I married. I understand patterns and data analysis. The communication patterns I saw suggested that someone was systematically sharing operational details with external contacts, and that this sharing accelerated in the weeks leading up to David's death. Morrison and Hendricks exchanged another look. If Mrs. Chen's analysis was correct, they were potentially looking at a sophisticated intelligence leak that had resulted in multiple combat deaths. Chen, Morrison said carefully, I need to ask you directly. Do you believe someone within our military structure deliberately provided information that led to your husband's death? The question hung in the air like a physical presence. Margaret had been grappling with this possibility for 3 months, but hearing it spoken aloud by a federal agent made it feel more real and more terrifying. Yes, she said quietly. I believe someone David trusted, someone with access to classified operational plans, sold information that resulted in an ambush. I believe my husband discovered this and was gathering evidence when he was killed. The room fell silent as the implications of Margaret's accusations sank in. If she was correct, they were dealing with not just a security breach, but potential treason that had resulted in the deaths of American soldiers. Major Hendricks spoke first. Mrs. Chen, assuming your analysis is correct, why do you think your husband didn't report this through official channels before his death? Margaret had thought about this question many times. David was a careful man, Major. He would have wanted to be absolutely certain of his facts before making such a serious accusation. Based on the dates on the files, I think he was still gathering evidence when the ambush occurred. Morrison stood and began pacing the small room. Mrs. Chen, what you're alleging is extremely serious. If proven true, it would represent one of the most damaging security breaches we've seen in years. But I need you to understand that investigating these claims will require us to thoroughly examine every aspect of your husband's final months, including his personal and professional relationships. I understand, Agent Morrison. David was a good man and an honorable soldier. I'm not afraid of what an investigation might reveal about him. I'm only afraid of what might happen if we don't investigate. At that moment, the door opened and Master Sergeant Williams returned, followed by a man whose presence immediately changed the atmosphere in the room. Colonel James Patterson was the base commander, a decorated veteran whose reputation for integrity and attention to detail made him one of the most respected officers at Fort Bradley. Mrs. Chen, Colonel Patterson said, extending his hand. I apologize for keeping you waiting. I've been briefed on your situation, and I want you to know that we take these allegations very seriously. Morrison stood and saluted. Colonel Patterson, Mrs. Chen has brought us potentially critical information about security breaches that may have resulted in the deaths of Colonel Chen and his unit. Colonel Patterson nodded grimly. Agent Morrison, I knew Colonel Chen personally. He was an outstanding officer and a good man. If there's even a possibility that his death was the result of a security breach, we need to pursue it with every resource available. He turned to Margaret. Mrs. Chen, I need you to understand that what happens next will likely be difficult for you personally. If we proceed with a full investigation, your husband's final months will be scrutinized in detail. His communications, his contacts, his movements, everything will be examined. Are you prepared for that level of scrutiny? Margaret thought of the 13 families who had lost loved ones in the ambush. Families who deserved to know the truth about how their soldiers had died. Colonel Patterson, David always said that the truth was worth any price. If investigating means that no other families have to go through what we've been through, then yes, I'm prepared for whatever comes next. Colonel Patterson smiled for the first time since entering the room. Mrs. Chen, your husband would be proud of your courage. Major Hendricks, I want you to coordinate with Agent Morrison to begin a preliminary review of Mrs. Chen's materials. If the initial analysis supports her allegations, we'll escalate this to the appropriate commands. As the meeting began to break up, Morrison approached Margaret with a business card. Mrs. Approach's first-name seller. Chen, I need you to understand that from this point forward, you're considered a critical witness in a potential national security investigation. That means you'll have protection, but it also means your movements may be monitored for your safety. Margaret accepted the card and looked around the room at the serious faces of the military personnel and federal agents who were now taking her seriously. 3 months ago, she had been a grieving widow, with what seemed like a far-fetched theory. Now, she was potentially the key witness in an investigation that could expose treachery at the highest levels of military operations. Agent Morrison, she said, I just want justice for David and those other soldiers, whatever it takes. As Margaret left the base that afternoon, she was unaware that her information had already triggered a series of secure communications that were racing up the military chain of command. By evening, her allegations would reach the Pentagon, and by the following morning, some of the most senior military leaders in the country would be reviewing the evidence she had provided. The woman who had been laughed at and dismissed for 3 months was about to discover that the truth she carried was more explosive than she had ever imagined, and that the people responsible for her husband's death had connections that reached much further than she had ever suspected. The investigation that was about to begin would ultimately require the attention of generals, cabinet-level officials, and intelligence agencies across multiple branches of government. But it had all started with a widow who refused to accept easy answers and kept returning to a base gate where soldiers had laughed at her determination to find the truth. 2 weeks after Margaret Chen's meeting with Agent Morrison and Colonel Patterson, the investigation had expanded far beyond what anyone at Fort Bradley could have anticipated. Deep within a secure facility outside Washington, D.C., a joint task force comprising members from the FBI, Defense Intelligence Agency, and Army Criminal Investigation Command had been working around the clock to verify and expand upon the information contained on David Chen's hidden flash drive. Special Agent Sarah Kim of the FBI had been assigned as the lead investigator for what was now designated as Operation Shadow Valley. At 38, Kim was known throughout the Bureau for her meticulous attention to detail and her ability to trace complex financial and communication networks. She had spent the past 10 days immersed in the digital evidence that Margaret Chen had provided, and what she had discovered was far more extensive than anyone had initially suspected. Ladies and gentlemen, Kim addressed the task force during their morning briefing. What we're looking at is not a simple case of information leaking. This appears to be a sophisticated espionage network that has been operating within our military structure for at least 18 months, possibly longer. The conference room fell silent as Kim clicked through a series of digital presentations showing communication patterns, financial transfers, and operational timelines that painted a picture of systematic betrayal. Colonel Chen wasn't just a victim, Kim continued. Based on the evidence he collected, he had identified multiple instances where operational details were being leaked to hostile forces. He had spent months building a case, documenting communication patterns and cross-referencing them with operational outcomes. General Morrison, who had been assigned to oversee the military aspects of the investigation, leaned forward in his chair. Agent Kim, what kind of operational outcomes are we talking about? Kim pulled up a new slide showing a map of Afghanistan and Iraq with multiple incident markers. Sir, we've identified at least 7 separate incidents over the past 18 months where American forces encountered unexpectedly heavy resistance or walked into what appeared to be prepared ambushes. In each case, there had been communications within our network that contained specific details about troop movements, timing, and objectives. The implications hung heavy in the room. 7 incidents meant potentially dozens of American casualties that could have been prevented if the security breach had been identified earlier. Do we have any suspects? Asked Colonel Matthews from Army CID. Kim nodded grimly. Colonel Chen's investigation had identified 3 individuals with access to the type of information that was being leaked. All 3 had financial irregularities that warranted further investigation. However, Colonel Chen died before he could complete his analysis or make his findings known to command. Meanwhile, 3,000 miles away at Fort Bradley, Margaret Chen was experiencing a very different kind of attention than she had received during her months of trying to get someone to listen to her concerns. A discreet security detail had been assigned to monitor her movements, not because she was suspected of wrongdoing, but because her knowledge of the investigation made her a potential target. Agent Morrison had visited her twice since their initial meeting, each time to clarify details about the information she had found and to provide updates on the investigation's progress. During their most recent meeting, he had delivered news that was both validating and deeply troubling. "Mrs. Chen," Morrison had explained, "I need you to understand that your husband's investigation appears to have been more comprehensive than we initially realized. He wasn't just collecting evidence about one leak. He was documenting what appears to be an organized effort to sell American military information to hostile forces." Margaret had listened with growing horror as Morrison described the scope of what David had discovered. Her husband had died not just because he was in the wrong place at the wrong time, but because he was close to exposing a network of traitors who were willing to kill American soldiers to protect their operations. "Agent Morrison," Margaret had asked, "does this mean that David's death wasn't just collateral damage from a leak? Does this mean he was deliberately targeted?" Morrison's expression had confirmed her worst fears even before he spoke. "Mrs. Chen, we believe your husband was killed because someone knew he was investigating them. The ambush that killed him and 12 other soldiers appears to have been specifically designed to eliminate him while making it look like a random enemy action." The investigation had also revealed something else that chilled everyone involved. The leak was still active. Communication intercepts suggested that whoever had killed Colonel Chen believed they had successfully stopped his investigation and eliminated the threat he represented. They had continued their operations, unaware that David's evidence had survived and was now in the hands of federal investigators. Back in Washington, Agent Kim was preparing to brief the highest levels of government about Operation Shadow Valley. The evidence had grown to encompass not just military operations, but also connections to international arms dealers, terrorist networks, and what appeared to be a sophisticated money laundering operation that involved millions of dollars in payments for American military intelligence. "Sir," Kim reported to FBI Director Harrison during a secure video conference, "this case has national security implications that extend far beyond the initial murder of Colonel Chen. We're looking at the systematic compromise of American military operations that has resulted in significant casualties and potentially altered the strategic situation in multiple theaters of operation." Director Harrison's expression was grim. "Agent Kim, how certain are we of these findings?" "Sir, the digital evidence is overwhelming." Colonel Chen was a trained intelligence officer who understood the importance of documentation. Every piece of evidence on his drive has been verified through independent sources. "We're not dealing with theories or speculation. We're dealing with documented proof of ongoing espionage that has cost American lives." The breakthrough in the case came when Kim's team successfully decoded a series of encrypted communications that David Chen had been tracking. The communications revealed not just the identities of the Americans involved in the espionage network, but also their international contacts and the specific methods they were using to transfer both information and money. What they discovered was shocking in its scope and sophistication. The network included a Marine Corps colonel stationed at the Pentagon, a Navy intelligence analyst with access to operational plans, and a civilian contractor who worked with multiple military commands. Together, they had been systematically selling American military intelligence for over 2 years, earning millions of dollars while American soldiers died as a result of their betrayals. The most shocking revelation came when Kim's team traced the financial networks associated with the espionage ring. The money wasn't just coming from traditional enemy governments or terrorist organizations. Some of the payments were being made by international corporations and arms dealers who were using the intelligence to position themselves advantageously in post-conflict reconstruction efforts. "They weren't just selling information to our enemies," Kim explained to the task force. "They were selling it to anyone willing to pay. including corporate interests who could profit from knowing where American military operations would create business opportunities. As the investigation expanded, it became clear that the network David Chen had uncovered was just one node in a much larger web of corruption and espionage that potentially involved dozens of individuals across multiple branches of the military and intelligence communities. The decision was made to move to the operational phase of the investigation. Simultaneous raids would be conducted to arrest the primary suspects, while additional teams moved to secure evidence and protect witnesses. The operation would require coordination across multiple time zones and involve hundreds of federal agents and military personnel. Margaret Chen was informed about the impending arrests during a meeting with Agent Morrison at a secure location off the base. Morrison explained, "Within the next 48 hours, we're going to arrest the people responsible for your husband's death. I need you to understand that once we move, this case will become public, and you'll likely face significant media attention." Margaret nodded, feeling a mixture of relief and apprehension. For months, she had carried the weight of knowing that David's death might not have been what it appeared to be. Now, she was about to see justice done, but she also understood that the truth would be painful for many families and communities within the military. "Agent Morrison," she asked, "will the families of the other soldiers who died with David be informed about what really happened?" Morrison's expression softened. "Yes, ma'am. They deserve to know the truth, just as you did. It won't bring their loved ones back, but it might provide some measure of closure to know that their deaths weren't meaningless and that the people responsible will be held accountable." As preparations for the arrests continued, word of the investigation began to reach the highest levels of military command. The Pentagon was quietly preparing for the public relations nightmare that would ensue when news broke that American military personnel had been systematically betraying their country for money. Plans were being made to review security protocols, reassess personnel screening procedures, and determine how such an extensive breach had gone undetected for so long. What none of them knew was that the arrests planned for the following day would reveal connections that reached even higher into the military hierarchy than anyone had suspected. The woman who had been laughed at for her persistence was about to become the catalyst for one of the largest espionage investigations in American military history. David Chen's hidden flash drive had contained more than just evidence of a crime. It had preserved a roadmap to dismantling a network of betrayal that had cost dozens of American lives and compromised military operations around the world. And it had all started with a widow who refused to accept that her husband's death was simply an unfortunate accident of war. The next phase of the investigation would require the involvement of the most senior levels of military command, and Margaret Chen would soon find herself face-to-face with generals who would thank her for her persistence rather than dismiss her concerns. The Pentagon's secure conference room was a place where the most critical decisions affecting American military operations were made. On this particular morning, it hosted an emergency meeting that would be remembered as one of the most significant in recent military history. 5 generals sat around the polished table, each representing different aspects of the massive investigation that had grown from Margaret Chen's persistent visits to Fort Bradley's main gate. General Patricia Morrison, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, called the meeting to order, with an expression that reflected the gravity of the situation. "Ladies and gentlemen, Operation Shadow Valley has concluded its arrest phase. I've called this meeting because the scope of what we've uncovered requires immediate attention at the highest levels of command. The arrests had taken place simultaneously at 0600 hours across multiple locations. Marine Colonel William Harding had been taken into custody at his Pentagon office while reviewing classified operational plans. Navy Lieutenant Commander Sandra Walsh had been arrested at her home in Virginia Beach. The civilian contractor Marcus Thompson had been apprehended at Dulles International Airport as he attempted to board a flight to Switzerland. General David Kim, head of Army Intelligence, provided the initial briefing. The evidence collected from the arrests confirms everything that Colonel Chen documented before his death. We're dealing with a systematic betrayal that has compromised American military operations for over 2 years, resulting in the deaths of at least 37 American service members. The number hit the room like a physical blow. What had started as an investigation into 13 deaths in Afghanistan had expanded to reveal casualties across multiple theaters of operation. General Morrison looked around the table at her colleagues, all of whom understood the implications of what they were hearing. "General Kim, What's the current status of operational security? Have we contained the breach? Yes, ma'am. All 3 primary suspects are in custody, and we've secured their communications networks. However, the investigation has revealed secondary contacts that we're still tracking. We believe we've stopped the immediate threat, but the damage assessment will continue for months. Air Force General Roberts leaned forward. What about Mrs. Chen? How is she handling all of this attention? It was a question that had been on everyone's minds. Margaret Chen had gone from being a dismissed widow to being the key witness in a major espionage case. The transition had been dramatic and difficult. Agent Sarah Kim, who had been invited to brief the generals, responded. Mrs. Chen has been remarkably resilient throughout the process. She understood from the beginning that pursuing this investigation would be difficult, but she's been focused on ensuring that justice is done for her husband and the other soldiers who died. General Morrison nodded. I think it's time we met Mrs. Dowhoun, Chen personally. She deserves to hear directly from us that her persistence and courage have prevented what could have been an even greater tragedy. 3 hours later, Margaret Chen found herself in a situation she never could have imagined when she first approached the gates of Fort Bradley. Agent Morrison had called her that morning to request that she come to Washington for what he described as a final briefing on the investigation. She had expected to meet with the same investigators she had been working with for weeks. Instead, she was being escorted through the corridors of the Pentagon to meet with the highest levels of military command. Margaret wore her best dress, a navy blue outfit that David had always said brought out her eyes. She carried the same leather bag that had accompanied her through months of investigation, though now it contained thank-you letters from the families of soldiers whose deaths had been avenged rather than the evidence that had started everything. The escort, a young Army captain, stopped outside an imposing door marked with security classifications that Margaret didn't understand. Mrs. Chen, the captain said respectfully, the generals are waiting inside. They specifically requested this meeting to thank you personally for what you've done. Margaret took a deep breath, thinking of David and the path that had brought her to this moment. She had never sought attention or recognition. She had simply wanted answers about her husband's death. Now, she was about to meet with the most senior military leaders in the country. The door opened to reveal the 5 generals, all of whom stood as she entered the room. For a moment, Margaret was transported back to that morning at Fort Bradley when soldiers had laughed at her determination to be heard. The contrast couldn't have been more stark. General Morrison stepped forward first. Mrs. Chen, I'm General Patricia Morrison, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. On behalf of the United States military, I want to thank you for your courage and persistence in bringing this matter to light. One by one, each of the generals introduced themselves and expressed their gratitude. General Kim shared how her husband's investigation had provided the roadmap for dismantling the entire espionage network. General Roberts explained how her determination to seek the truth had prevented additional casualties. Each acknowledgement carried the weight of recognition from leaders who understood the full scope of what she had accomplished. Mrs. Chen, General Morrison continued, I need you to understand the significance of what your husband discovered and what you preserved. The network we've dismantled was responsible for compromising military operations across multiple theaters. Your refusal to accept easy answers has saved American lives. Margaret felt tears welling in her eyes as she thought of David and how proud he would have been to know that his final investigation had made such a difference. General Morrison, I'm honored by your words, but I need you to understand something. I didn't do this for recognition or thanks. I did it because 13 soldiers died with my husband, and their families deserve to know the truth. General Morrison smiled for the first time during the meeting. Mrs. Chen, that's exactly why we're here today. Your motivation wasn't personal glory. It was justice for fallen soldiers and their families. That's the highest form of service to this country. Agent Kim briefed Margaret on the final outcomes of the investigation. All 3 primary suspects had confessed and provided information about their international contact. The financial networks had been dismantled, recovering millions of dollars in payments for stolen intelligence. Most importantly, security protocols had been revised to prevent similar breaches in the future. Mrs. Chen, Agent Kim explained, your husband's investigation methods are being studied and incorporated into our counterintelligence training programs. His work will help protect American soldiers for years to come. As the meeting continued, Margaret learned about the broader implications of the case. The arrests had sent shockwaves through international intelligence communities and had forced allied nations to review their own security protocols. The case had also led to congressional hearings about military security and intelligence oversight. General Morrison presented Margaret with a letter of commendation signed by the Secretary of Defense, recognizing her contribution to national security. Mrs. Chen, this letter will become part of the official record of this investigation. Future historians will understand that the exposure of this espionage network began with a widow who refused to be silenced. The meeting concluded with General Morrison making a personal promise that Margaret found deeply meaningful. Mrs. Chen, I want to assure you that Colonel Chen's service and sacrifice will be properly recognized. We're recommending him for posthumous decorations that reflect his final investigation's contribution to national security. As Margaret prepared to leave, General Kim approached her with a final request. Mrs. Chen, the Army would like to establish a memorial scholarship in Colonel Chen's name for military intelligence officers. Would you be willing to work with us on that project? Margaret accepted immediately, knowing that David would have wanted his legacy to be about training future officers to protect American soldiers. As she shook hands with each of the generals, she thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment. 6 months earlier, she had been a grieving widow with questions about her husband's death. 3 months ago, she had been dismissed as a nuisance by soldiers at a base gate. Now she stood in the Pentagon receiving thanks from the highest levels of military command for her role in exposing one of the most damaging espionage cases in recent history. As Margaret left the Pentagon that day, she carried with her not just the gratitude of generals, but the knowledge that David's final investigation had achieved its purpose. The people responsible for betraying American soldiers had been brought to justice, and measures had been put in place to prevent similar tragedies in the future. The soldiers who had laughed at her determination to be heard would later learn about the true scope of what she had accomplished. Master Sergeant Williams, who had been the first to take her seriously, would be promoted and assigned to a new security protocol development team. The base where she had been dismissed would establish new procedures for handling civilian reports about potential security issues. But perhaps most importantly, the families of the 37 soldiers who had died as a result of the espionage network would finally understand that their loved ones had not died in vain. They had died because of betrayal, but their deaths had ultimately led to the exposure of that betrayal and the protection of future soldiers. Margaret Chen returned home to Texas knowing that her husband's final mission had been completed. The intelligence officer who had spent his career protecting American soldiers had, through his widow's determination, managed to protect them even after his death. The woman who had been laughed at for her persistence had become the catalyst for one of the most important counterintelligence victories in recent military history. David Chen's hidden flash drive had contained more than evidence. It had contained a promise that the truth would eventually come to light. Margaret Chen had kept that promise, and in doing so, she had honored not just her husband's memory, but the memory of every soldier who had died as a result of the betrayal they had fought to expose. The generals who stood and saluted her had recognized something that the guards at the gate had missed. Sometimes the most important truths come from the most unexpected sources, and sometimes justice depends on the determination of those who refuse to be silenced.